whole country is under an extreme cold wave today with heavy snowfall on the west coast and in the south, including Jeju. The cold snap is likely to continue throughout the week. South Korea's Supreme Court today upheld two lower court rulings that ordered Japanese firms to compensate Koreans forced into wartime labor, some 10 years after the suits were filed. Against this backdrop, Korea and Japan today held their long-stalled high-level economic dialogue. A long overdue budget for next year was approved today at the National Assembly. That's worth $500 billion with more investment in R&D. It's December 21st, 2023. This is Newscenter.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Jung-min. The whole country is under a cold wave today with heavy snowfall on the west coast and in the south. Our Lee Soo-jin is live in Gwanghwamun, Seoul. Soo-jin, what's it like there? How cold?
In short, Jung-min, it's very cold. The Arctic cold wave has swept across the nation, and it feels like the entire country is stuck in a freezer. Right now, the temperatures are at -9 degrees Celsius, and morning temperatures in Seoul on Thursday morning plummeted to -14 degrees Celsius, marking the coldest morning this winter so far. And the feels like temperature dropped to -22.3 degrees Celsius. Even on Jeju Island, located in the far south of the Korean peninsula, temperatures there have fallen below 0 degrees. The highest daytime temperatures in the majority of the country were below 0, and this cold is expected to continue until Saturday morning. Let's take a listen to how cold people in Seoul are feeling.
I didn't really notice the cold up to 2 days ago, but today my ears and nose feel like they're frozen.
I arrived in Seoul on 18th of December, and I think today is the coolest.
Looks freezing cold. Soo-jin, what about other parts of the country?
Well, gentlemen, the bitter cold season is definitely being felt by the entire country. Heavy snowfall warnings are in effect for the west coast of Chungcheongnam-do province and the Jeollado provinces. There have also been many reports of water meters freezing. According to the Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasures Headquarters on Thursday, as of 11 p.m. on Wednesday, a total of 72 cases have been reported, including 26 in Seoul, 37 in Gyeonggi-do province, and 3 in Incheon. Earlier, the Ministry of Interior and Safety also upped its heavy snow warning level from caution to alert starting at 8 p.m. on Wednesday, raising the emergency response from level 1 to level 2. Heavy snow is continued to be in the forecast for western coastal areas and the southern resort island of Jeju Island, where heavy snow of up to 30 centimeters is expected until Thursday night. Over Hwasa Mountain on Jeju Island, there was an accumulation of snow of up to 53.6 centimeters from yesterday until 1 p.m. today, and access to all 7 trails around the mountains has been closed off. At Jeju International Airport, a total of 77 flights have been delayed due to strong wind warnings. The slippery roads have already led to accidents. At 3:30 a.m. on Thursday, 9 vehicles, including a cargo truck and an intercity bus, collided on a highway in Chungcheongnam-do province, leaving the driver dead and 10 injured. At 5:37 a.m. in Jeju Island, a car skidded into a ditch and injured the driver. The KMA says a severe cold is expected to continue until Saturday morning, while the Interior Ministry has vowed to do all to minimize damage from the heavy snowfall and respond immediately, mobilizing all the resources that are available. And that's all I have for now. Back to you, Jung-min.
Our Lee Soo-jin live from Gwanghwamun Square. Thank you. Stay safe. South Korea's top court today upheld rulings that ordered Japanese companies Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Nippon Steel to compensate the Korean victims of wartime forced labor some 10 years after those suits were filed. Correspondent Choi Min-jung explains.
South Korea's Supreme Court has once again ruled in favor of Korean victims of forced labor during Japan's colonial rule between 1910 to 1945. The top court on Thursday upheld rulings that ordered 2 Japanese firms to compensate the victims. Japan's Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Nippon Steel are ordered to pay a maximum of 150 million won, or around $115,000 to each victim. Combined with extra damages for the delay, they are ordered to pay around $900,000 in total. A total of 11 plaintiffs won the ruling, 4 against Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and 7 against Nippon Steel. However, all the plaintiffs have died of old age since the lawsuit was first filed 9 years ago. Thursday's rulings were the first such outcomes by the top court since 2018. Back then, the South Korean court made landmark rulings on separate forced labor cases, ordering the two Japanese companies to compensate other former Korean victims. The 2018 ruling soured relations between South Korea and Japan, as Tokyo argued that related issues were completely settled under a 1965 bilateral agreement. Japan's reaction is not much different this time around.
These rulings are in clear violation of Article 2 of the Japan-Korea Claims Agreement and are extremely regrettable and absolutely unacceptable. We have protested this matter to South Korea.
As the defendants Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Nippon Steel are likely to continue refusing to pay the compensation, the government is expected to compensate the victims using funds procured through a public foundation. The plan was announced earlier this year to improve relations with Japan.
In line with the government's compensation plan announced in March, we plan to pay the compensation and damages for delay through the Foundation of Victims of Forced Mobilization by Imperial Japan.
With such a plan already in place and taking into account Japan's continued denial, it's unlikely that the Japanese firms will pay the compensation themselves. The Japanese companies have yet to pay the previously ordered compensation, claiming the statute of limitations has passed. But for the very first time, the court on Thursday clarified that this would not be allowed. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
And against this backdrop, Seoul and Tokyo today revived a long-stalled economic dialogue with a focus on supply chain and technology cooperation. Our foreign affairs correspondent Pei Eun-ji has the details.
For the first time in 8 years, the foreign ministries of South Korea and Japan held high-level economic talks. They took place at South Korea's Ministry of Foreign Affairs on Thursday afternoon, led by the Deputy Foreign Minister for Economic Affairs, Kang Jae-kwon, and Japan's Senior Deputy Foreign Minister, Keiichi Ono. The two sides are likely to have discussed issues on economic security, such as supply chain and technology cooperation. Eyes are on whether the discussion extended to the lawsuit filed against Japanese companies by Korean wartime forced labor victims, or South Korea's import ban on Japanese seafood originating from Fukushima. This is the 15th time that the two countries have held economic dialogue after it was first launched in 1999 to discuss comprehensive economic cooperation. It was last held in January 2016 in Tokyo. The Japanese government postponed the meeting in late 2016 when a statue of a girl symbolizing Korean victims of Japan's wartime sexual slavery was built in front of the Japanese consulate in South Korea's port city of Busan. The meeting remained suspended as bilateral relations between Seoul and Tokyo worsened over several issues stemming from Japan's colonial rule of Korea before and during World War II. Then bilateral relations started to improve starting March this year, after South Korea announced its plan to compensate victims of Japan's wartime forced labor. And the leaders of the two countries agreed in July to resume the high-level economic dialogue by the end of this year. The Foreign Ministry expressed hope of further improvements in bilateral relations, saying the talks could become an opportunity for the two countries to move toward a future-oriented relationship. Pei Eun-ji, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, across the border, there has been more hostile rhetoric from North Korea as Kim Jong-un vows to resort to nuclear weapons to retaliate if provoked with nuclear weapons. Our North Korean affairs correspondent Kim Jong-sil reports.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and his daughter Chue on Wednesday took pictures with the missile bureau that carried out a launch drill for the Hwasong-18 intercontinental ballistic missile on Monday morning. This is according to the North state-run Korean Central News Agency on Thursday. There, the leader encouraged the Missile Bureau and said North Korea would not hesitate to carry out a nuclear attack if the enemy provokes it with nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, Kim Yo-jong, the younger sister of Kim Jong-un, issued a statement on Thursday in response to the UN Security Council emergency session that followed the North's missile launch. She said North Korea is, quote, deeply offended and strongly condemns the meeting, saying the UNSC is hosting conferences criticizing North Korea's right to self-defense. In response to Kim Yo-jong's remarks, a South Korean Unification Ministry official told reporters on the same day that North Korea is refusing to be part of a normal international community by repeatedly violating UN Security Council resolutions, an obligation under the UN Charter that all member states must abide by. The official also added that the South Korean government maintains the same stance that the North's regime would see an end if it were to use a nuclear weapon. Over at the National Assembly, where the National Defense Committee meeting took place, Defense Minister Shin Won-sik reiterated his stance to respond strongly against Pyongyang's continued military provocations.
North Korea has violated the September 19 military agreement around 3,600 times. The only thing that can curb North Korea's unwavering ambitions is great power.
The minister added that the South Korean military is maintaining a strong ROK-US alliance against Pyongyang's provocations. Kim Jong-sil, Arirang News.
A notable change was spotted in South Korea's foreign policy in the year 2023. Looking back on the past year, I had a chance to talk to VOA correspondent Jessica Stone and Japan correspondent for the Straits Times Walter Sim earlier. Take a look. Jessica, first, back in April, Presidents Yoon and Biden adopted the Washington Declaration, and in August, they cemented their trilateral cooperation with Japan's Prime Minister Kishida through the Camp David principles. How does Washington assess its renewed relationship with Seoul and Tokyo, and what does it mean for the U.S. to align its collective efforts with allies and partners at a time when the stakes are high on the Korean Peninsula and around the world?
Well, we are seeing a deepening of the relationship, not only between the U.S. and South Korea, but between the U.S., South Korea, and Japan, because throughout the year, we've seen a series of meetings throughout the government. So according to the U.S., these alliances are critical. They're a critical part of countering North Korea's military and nuclear program, as well as its space satellite activities. Allegations that North Korea is providing weapons to Russia, which Moscow denies, in its fight against Ukraine. And allies are preparing for more North Korean threats in 2024. And so these are all kinds of reasons why the deepening of these ties, not just because of what's happening on the Korean Peninsula, but also because of North Korea's weapons proliferation around the world.
Right, there's a host of issues. And Walter, the relations between Seoul and Tokyo marked a turning point in March. By that, I meant the better trade relations and the two leaders' frequent meetings. What's the atmosphere in Tokyo like regarding a thaw in the bilateral relationship this past year?
Well, the atmosphere has definitely been very positive. So Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida obviously sees South Korean President Yoon as a foreign leader whom he can trust over their multiple meetings, as you pointed out. But of course, there are still obstacles to their relationship, such as the South Korean court ruling this month that ordered Tokyo to pay about 200 million won to each of the 16 comfort women defendants. But the fact that the news cycle has, at least in Japan, really moved on suggests that the government wants to really manage its ties with South Korea to prevent relations from worsening. Of course, this positive mood has spillover effects. It has really benefited cultural ties. So we see Korean food, Korean culture, Korean music, K-pop becoming extremely popular in Japan, I think.
And Walter, the leaders often describe North Korea's provocations as unprecedented this year. There was a rare Kim Jong-un Putin summit in September. Ever since that, Pyongyang's military ties with Moscow have gotten closer than ever. That really culminated with North Korea launching a military spy satellite with help from Russia as it continues to advance its nuclear and missile programs, as well as cyber threats. What are the power dynamics in East Asia like, involving China and Russia? Where does the Seoul, Washington, Tokyo security cooperation stand in this region?
Well, there definitely is cause, and I don't think the leaders were, overstating the threat when they described Pyongyang's provocations as unprecedented. So definitely there is a lot of room, as Jessica mentioned earlier, for very close security collaboration and coordination in the region between South Korea, the US, as well as Japan. But if I may add on to that, I also do see Japan and South Korea hoping to maintain stable relations with China, and this is obviously evident from their recent trilateral foreign ministers meeting in Busan. That ended in a pledge for a leader summit meeting as soon as possible. As Jessica pointed out, if tensions were to rise even further over the Taiwan Strait, the Japan and the United States would surely want to involve the South Korean security apparatus even more, alongside the US forces in South Korea, to help contain tensions over the Taiwan Strait as well.
Jessica, eyes are on the 2024 U.S. presidential election. How might the election results affect its bilateral ties with South Korea and the three-way cooperation with Japan? Are we going to see a dramatic change in policy regarding the Korean Peninsula depending on the election results?
I think the linchpin to answer that question is whether or not Joe Biden wins, in which case we'll see a continuation of the existing policy of deepening alliances throughout the Indo-Pacific between the U.S. and its Indo-Pacific partners. But if Donald Trump wins, who is the leading nominee in the Republican fight, we're likely to see some possible changes, particularly in the U.S.-South Korea relationship.
Walter Shim, Japan correspondent of the Straits Times, and Jessica Stone, correspondent of Voice of America. Thank you for your time. For more and what to look forward to in 2024, you can check out the whole story on our year-end special program on the last day of December at 11 p.m. Korea time. South Korea's National Assembly has passed a budget bill for 2024 that's been long overdue due to partisan disputes, particularly over cuts in research and development. Moon Hae-ryun has the details.
After months of debate, the country's spending plans for the coming year are set. The National Assembly passed the budget bill in a plenary session on Thursday. While the statutory processing deadline was almost 3 weeks ago, the two rival parties had failed to reach an agreement until now. There's been several changes made to the proposal submitted by the Finance Ministry in August, from the total budget to how much has been allocated to each sector. The total budget is some 656.6 trillion Korean won, or roughly $500 billion US. But that's around $180 million lower than the proposed amount. Fiscal soundness is becoming increasingly important due to the country's rising debt to GDP ratio. The projected debt to GDP ratio for 2024 is 51%. As a result, the government proposed cutting the budget for the R&D, education and public administration sectors to reduce spending. But the unprecedented slash in the research and development sector sparked debate, as it's the first time since 1991 that R&D has seen a decrease compared to the year before, with the proposed budget seeing a 16.6% drop from 2023. The final budget saw increases in budgets for science and technology, industry, SMEs and energy, social welfare and transport, but drops in public administration and local government budgets, as well as a decrease in the national defense budget compared to the proposal. The budget bill proposed earlier this year had a focus on strengthening social welfare, and this was reflected in the final spending plan for 2024. There was a concentration on supporting young people in particular. An additional $53 million designated for extending housing support for young people, and nearly $17 million for an initiative to give young people discounts for using public transport. It's not just young people, however, who will be benefiting from the changes in the budget proposal. An extra $4.3 million has been added to support farmers and fishermen with their electricity bills, and the pension system for the handicapped will see the biggest rise since 2013 with an additional $21 million. Meanwhile, the development project in the reclaimed wetland area of Semiconductor was another major point of contention, and the two parties agreed to increase its budget by $230 million. Moon Hae-ryun, Arirang News.
Justice Minister Han Dong-hoon has stepped down from his post and accepted the ruling People Power Party's proposal to chair its Emergency Leadership Committee. This is according to the party's floor leader and its acting chairman Yoon Jae-ok on Thursday. It's expected the official appointment will take place on Tuesday and the launch of its committee within this year. This follows the resignation of the former party leader Kim Ki-hyun under pressure to regain voter confidence ahead of the general election in April. The main opposition Democratic Party leader Lee Jae-myung congratulated Han and said he hopes Han will thoroughly fulfill his responsibility as leader. Elsewhere, hopes for a humanitarian halt in combat have been rendered uncertain as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reiterates his intentions to fight until all Hamas militants are down. Jin tells us more.
On Wednesday, amid reports about a possible deal between Israel and Hamas for a second humanitarian pause in Gaza, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said in a televised statement that the war would end only with Hamas eradicated, all hostages freed, and Gaza no longer posing a threat. In the statement, he also vowed to eradicate Hamas, saying that the militant group has two options: surrender or die.
We are continuing the war to the end. It will continue until Hamas is eliminated, until victory. All Hamas terrorists, from the first to the last, are dead men walking. They have only two possibilities: surrender or die.
Netanyahu said his defense forces are continuing to strike the militant group with heavy fire, adding that those that help Hamas will also be targeted. Meanwhile, on Wednesday, a UN Security Council vote on a resolution to expand humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip and ask the UN to monitor the humanitarian aid deliveries there was postponed at the request of the United States. This is the third time the resolution has been delayed. According to Reuters, the vote has been repeatedly postponed due to differences of opinion among members over the text of the draft. The resolution was drafted by the United Arab Emirates with the aim of diluting Israel's control over all humanitarian aid deliveries to some 2.3 million people in Gaza. Currently, Israel monitors the limited humanitarian aid and fuel deliveries to Gaza through the Rafah crossing from Egypt and the Israel-controlled Kerem Shalom crossing. Washington is standing by its tradition of shielding its ally Israel from UN action. The vote on the resolution is now set to take place on Thursday. According to Gaza's health ministry, also on Wednesday, the death toll in the Gaza Strip has surpassed 20,000 since Israel began bombarding the enclave more than 10 weeks ago. The Gaza government's media office says at least 8,000 children and 6,200 women are among those killed. Since the collapse of a 7-day truce on December 1st, the war has entered a more intensive phase. Ground combat had previously been confined to the northern half of the Gaza Strip, but has now spread to cover almost the whole length of the region. Jin, Arirang News.
The fierce Arctic cold wave has remained for the whole day. In addition, the wind is bringing the wind chill temperatures down. The strongest cold wave of around -15 degrees Celsius will continue tomorrow and will stay until the day after tomorrow. The number of winter illnesses is increasing rapidly in this freezing winter. Please take care. Heavy snow is forecast on the west coast and Jeju Island. By tomorrow, more than 60 centimeters of heavy snow is expected in the mountainous areas of Jeju Island and more than 40 in western Jeollabuk-do province. The western part of Jeollanam-do province and the west coast area of Chungcheongnam-do province will also receive more than 20 centimeters of snow. Lows in Seoul tomorrow will start off at -15 degrees. Daily highs in Seoul will get up to -7, Daegu and Gyeongju -2 degrees Celsius. Snow on the west coast will continue until tomorrow, and Jeju Island will have snow throughout the weekend. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
And that is Newscenter for tonight. Thank you for watching. A panel session is up next.
한국에 오면 먹어야죠. 먹어도 끝이 없는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니?
Children's laughter, hope, dream. K-animation belongs in them. Interesting and valuable story that transcends between everyday life and dream. Surprising spectacle where imagination becomes real. An array of subjects catering from infants to adolescents. For our story to reach all corners of the world. K-animation makes healthy laughter for children.
It's the perfect movie to watch on Christmas with your family, I think. Yes, like watching this movie really makes you want to be with your family even more.
엄마, 교토에 가고 싶다. And the president also remains committed to boosting Korea's ties with its global partners on the sidelines of this latest.
To discuss the current security environment.
The United Nations most powerful body on global security, expressing hope.
Stock markets around the world have taken a hit amid speculation that the U.S. Federal Reserve
Arirang.
Hello everyone, it's Thursday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Exports are a major driver for the South Korean economy, and so it is important to boost the competitiveness of promising sectors such as semiconductors, rechargeable batteries, and cars. Though the chip industry appears to be bottoming out, it is still waiting for momentum for a definite rebound. And in terms of the secondary battery industry, the country is indeed in a leading position, but high overseas dependence for materials and components remains a concern. How are South Korea's promising sectors doing, and what are other areas that Seoul's economy could perhaps rely on in the future? For this, we have invited Professor Yang Jun-seok from the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, welcome.
Happy to be here.
And we also have Trin Nguyen, a senior economist at Natixis. Good to have you with us, Trin.
Thank you for having me.
Now, first question to our Trin. According to recent data, semiconductor exports grew a month in November for the first time since August 2022. Some say the industry is on a recovery track, though it may be slow. Is that the case?
We already got positive news with the first 20 days of exports, right? Exports came up quite strongly, double digits increase, and the underlying is quite supportive with the chip sector, but not just the chip sector. We got consumer electronics, oil, and so on and so forth. And so Korea, given the fact that the base is very bad for most of 2023, should see a big rebound in 2024 as inventories are increasingly depleted, and if demand recovers, then you should be staged for a rebound. And I think that should be positive for South Korea exports in 2024.
All right, I see. And as our Trin already told us, Professor Yang, semiconductor market is expected to rebound thanks to many reasons, but one of them is the growing demand for high bandwidth memory with the AI industry enlarging. In what ways could South Korean chip makers use this as an opportunity?
Well, I think we should not expect sort of a tsunami of increasing demand that we saw during the pandemic. I think there will be a growth in demand because of the AI and some of the new development, but it might be slow, but luckily perhaps more long-term in nature because the growth will grow steadily, but perhaps a bit slower than we would like. One of the additional elements that we should look into is, well, we were expecting a really heavy demand for semiconductors during the second half of the year, but it was only realized during November or October. And that's because the U.S. interest rate and the global interest rate remained fairly high, and that cut down the investment demand for semiconductors by big tech firms. Now, if the Fed signal for lower interest rate next year comes true, then we may have very steadily high demand for semiconductors. But if the interest rate remains high, then we should be prepared for a slow growth in semiconductor demand. It will still grow, but it might be slower than what we were expecting.
I see. So there will be recovery, but it could be slow. One more question, Professor Yang. Recently, Dutch semiconductor industry supplier ASML agreed to invest around 1 trillion Korean won with Samsung Electronics to establish a research facility in South Korea, as well as boost cooperation with SK Hynix as well. How significant is such a deal for South Korea's major chip makers?
Okay, well, SMNL is perhaps the most critical company and link in the high-quality semiconductor supply chain because they're the only company capable of making semiconductor manufacturing equipment that can etch circuits to a narrow degree that supports very high-tech semiconductors. So closer cooperation between Samsung, Hynix, and ASML is, I think, always good news. They can affect each other, they can influence each other's research, and they could more easily develop customized manufacturing equipment that Samsung or Hynix may need. Now, having said that, though, ASML also has a very close relationship with Samsung and Hynix's biggest rival, TSMC. So in some ways, having this closer relationship between ASML and Samsung and Hynix, well, Korea is playing catch up to Taiwan. But as I said, I think more closer cooperation is very good news. Even if we may be behind Taiwan a little bit, this will give us a chance to catch up.
All right, it's good news for South Korea's major chip makers, I see. Now, Trin, based on what our Professor Yang told us, the presidential office noted that South Korea was able to forge a global semiconductor alliance connecting the entire process from design to material components, equipment, and manufacturing, with President Yoon's visit to the U.S., Japan, the UK, and the Netherlands. Do you believe bolstering ties with such countries would help reduce the geopolitical risks for chips?
Well, I think Korea is positioning itself quite well. I think obviously chips is at the forefront of what the U.S. wants to retain because the U.S. is dominating in design and the manufacturing has taken over by Taiwan and of course South Korea. And Korea has been able to basically increase investment in the U.S. as well as getting exemptions, being able to export to China. But China wants to raise its self-sufficiency in chips. And I think fundamentally, with a lot of subsidies thrown at it, it remains quite an important threat to Korea manufacturing of chips, even if it's able to still have a bit of a technological frontier at the moment. And I think we can see that in other sectors. At the lower end, China has carved out a bit of a space, but it still wants to go higher. And I think you can see that in other sectors, such as EV, solar, and so on and so forth. And so as a result, I think anything that Korea can do to really retain its competitive advantage is quite important moving forward.
All right, I see your point, Trin. Now, since our Trin came up with the EV, I'd like to talk about the secondary battery industry. Professor Yang, shifting gears a bit here. So secondary battery industry is also a very important sector for South Korea. And so the South Korean government is to provide a total of 38 trillion Korean won in policy financing by 2028. Could you tell us more about this plan?
Okay, well, Korean firms, if you exclude China, that's the big caveat. If you exclude China, it accounts for about 49% of global production. Chinese firms are still the largest global manufacturers of batteries. And Korea is dependent on China for a lot of crucial chemicals and rare earths, such as cobalt, lithium, and nickel. Now, the government's 5-year plan is to invest 38 trillion won in the battery industry. Export-Import Bank will double its capital allocated for lending and guaranteeing Korean battery manufacturers from 15 trillion to 30 trillion won. And this, I think, is interesting. Within 3 years, Korea will build a strategic reserve storage facility for semiconductors dealing with rare earth and chemicals at Saemangam. So if you're keeping up with Korean politics, I think that is a very interesting place to put the strategic storage facility. And then by 2031, the government plans to build up 100 days worth of strategic reserves in these rare earth and chemicals. But perhaps more important, Korea is going to start a recycling project for batteries. It's because, well, rare earths are rare. So we need to recycle the current batteries or batteries which no longer work to recover those rare earths, recover those chemicals so that they could be used for new batteries. U.S. IRA foresees a time when most of its rare earth are coming from recycled old batteries rather than trying to get it from China or other natural sources.
All right, I see your point. And Chun, as our Professor Yang already pointed out, raw materials and components of secondary batteries are reportedly very much reliant on imports from China. Could you tell us how dependent South Korea is?
Korea is actually running a deficit with China, and increasingly in areas that it used to dominate, right? So South Korea dominates in high tech, and it's an area it enjoys, and it's trying to hold on to semiconductor. But in areas, and it's already seeing the erosion of intermediates as China, which it doesn't highlight anymore, the Made in 2025 wants to be self-sufficient, right? In many areas, and so its rise in intermediate exports is a huge threat to South Korea. And the fact is that China dominates the processing of raw materials needed to make batteries. That's about 75% of the 4 key components. And it's actually moving into the production of batteries itself, right? As the professor mentioned, China actually globally dominates about 60% of that. And Korea's share of that has declined to about 20% from 30% before the pandemic. Now, if you exclude the China market, South Korea has about roughly 50%, but that roughly 50% is a decline from previously. And China's rise now is to 30%. So even in non-Chinese market, China is seeing a rise. So that is a big threat for China, and then rightly so that South Korea is deploying a lot of capital. Its largest outward FDI is into the U.S., where it sees itself nodding to having to compete with China, which basically dominate this market through sheer will, through subsidies, through not really caring so much about profits. Profit margins have declined substantially for Chinese battery makers, right? But they care about the supply side of economics rather than demand, because they want to continue to grow where areas where they want to be fully self-sufficient. And so as a result, I think Korea will continue to carve out also markets where it doesn't have to compete with China, and I think it's an area where increasingly the IRA is an example where they will continue to carve out non-China markets such as the U.S., and that it will continue to be an important area of growth for South Korea. And also they will have to think about the supply chain dependency, right? COVID shows us that we're too dependent on China. And within certain categories, that dependency is quite large, and EV is one of them.
Right. And that being said, Professor Yang, what measures should South Korea take to reduce such overseas dependency and perhaps, to deal with China's rise?
Okay, well, we have to remember that we've known that this problem exists for quite a while. As China's technology improves, Korea used to sell a lot of these somewhat lower tech intermediate goods to China, but China has replaced them with their own domestically produced intermediate goods. Now, what Korea should be doing is to improve its technology so that it's always ahead about a certain amount to Chinese technology. I'm not sure if we've done that very well. There has been always a concern that Korea is technology-wise sandwiched between China and Japan. China's catching up, but Korea is not necessarily leading ahead. So there has to be more research, more development into higher technology, higher value-added products, and then for supply chain concerns. One of the reasons why we're so dependent on China is because Chinese products are just so inexpensive that producers naturally gravitate toward the lowest cost producers. So if we do want to get away from that, then either Korean manufacturers will have to find an alternate source which is as inexpensive, which is very doubtful, or the government has to provide subsidies, or consumers have to face the fact that if they want a steady supply, then they may have to pay more because they want to source from diverse sources rather than from a single, albeit inexpensive source. And one of the ways around that is probably recycling, as we talked about in the last question. Recycling the elements which are already here. If we develop a good enough recycling technology, we should be able to recover a lot of these rare earth and chemicals that we're currently importing from China.
All right, well, thank you for giving us a direction, Professor Yang. Now, I'd like to forecast the industry, the secondary battery industry in 2024. As we all know, the secondary battery is really important for electric vehicles. And regarding this market trend, worries include the continuing slowdown in the growth rate and the possibility of Donald Trump winning the presidential election, as he is less likely to embrace it. How do you forecast the EV market to be next year?
Well, the good news is that the election is not happening to the end of November, right? So 2024, you don't have to worry about the Trump factor. But we can worry about the interest rates are expected to decline, but they're priced into the market. They haven't declined yet, right? So the consumers, I mean, the mortgage market, you're seeing a bit of that because it's priced towards the longer end of the curve, which has priced in a lot of cuts in the future that haven't materialized. So meaning that consumers still feel a bite from higher interest rates. And as that bite, that lag effect of the Fed monetary policy, that should kind of temper a little enthusiasm, meaning the growth, the exceptional growth of EV you've seen in the US is likely to go into slow. But still, that's going to be the key driver of the EV market globally because it still has the IRA subsidies. So that should help. And in the second half of the year for 2024, the fact that rates are going lower, we think that the Fed's going to cut in May is going to support. Now, the other markets are not going to be so supportive, right? China slow down, Europe slow down is going to drive a slower growth into 2024. So in other words, it's still going to be an important, it's going to grow quite substantially, and particularly in the US market, but it's going to slow from great heights of 2023. And I think that is going to, it's already penciled into the market as forward guidance are given for 2024. And I think for Korea, the export market will continue to be quite strong, but it's not going to be as strong as 2023. And beyond 2024, one of the key drivers of exports will not be there because the onshore capacity for the investment that Korea has made into the US, right? The factories are going to start to take advantage of the IRA. Because one of the key requests is that it needs to be produced in the U.S. And then that means that Korean manufacturers will benefit, but onshore Korean production and onshore export to the U.S. will likely decline from 2025 forward. So I think 2024 export will continue to be quite strong, but 2025 and moving forward, we'll have other drivers, whether Trump or not. You will have the fact that the key IRA component is that production will be made in the U.S. So Hyundai production will be increasingly in the U.S. versus shipment from Korea into the U.S. So that will slow down exports beyond 2024.
All right, I see, Trin. Thank you for your projection. Now, Professor Yang, another major pillar of South Korean exports is actually the automobile industry, including the EV, of course. So let's take a broader look at that. South Korea's automobile exports this year have hit a record high for the January to November period. I'd like to know what drove this trend, and I'd like to also ask you how you forecast for South Korea's car exports for 2024 as well.
Okay, well, more than 2 million vehicles were exported this year. That's about 1 out of 2 vehicles produced in Korea. And the export value is expected to reach $70 billion. That's going to be an historical high. Why was the export demand so high? Well, a lot of it seems to be a pent-up demand. People wanted automobiles during the pandemic, but a lot of automobiles were not available because we had shortages in automobile-related semiconductors semiconductors. Now that they are available, people seem to be buying up automobiles. They still seem to have money left over from payments made during the pandemic by the U.S. government, so they are using it to buy automobiles. The part of the demand, pent-up demand, is not going to be around next year. U.S. Growth rate is expected to slow down substantially next year as well. So we will probably still see some rise in exports, but it will be nowhere as dramatic as this year. I wouldn't be surprised if it fell a little bit, but my crystal ball says it will continue to rise, just not at the current breakneck speed. But still, the pent-up demand will go away, I think. So we should be prepared for a very much slower growth than this year.
All right. Thank you, Professor Yang, and your crystal ball. All right. Well, we are running out of time, but I'd like to ask this last question to our Trin. Aside from what we have discussed so far, what are promising sectors that could potentially drive exports for South Korea? Could you briefly tell us?
China imports should improve, right? China has been quite, demand is very bad, so Chinese consumption should bounce. So beyond the ICT cycle, you should actually see an increase of demand from China, and that should be supportive for South Korea because it's an important market for South Korea, even if it's trying to diversify into other markets such as the US. So I think for Korean exports, and also oil is another one, right? Oil declined quite substantially, so refinery activity should go up, should oil rise, demand rise, with China normalization of demand. So China growth itself will slow on a headline basis, but I think actual demand will show a firmer than what we have seen of demand for Korea. And beyond just what we discussed, which is auto, which has been a key driver of export growth, while other areas have declined quite substantially. So auto will take a bit of a backseat into the growth driver. And even though auto itself will grow, it's not going to be a gangbuster growth. And you'll see chips and as well as consumer electronics and etc. will do a bit better. And I think on an aggregate, Korean exports itself will grow much stronger than what we've seen.
All right, Trin, thank you for your point of view. Well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Yang and Trin, for your time and insights as usual. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching and goodbye.